Hello, and thanks for tuning in. Anthony Carnavale is an education policy champion. As a strong advocate for equity and opportunity, he has a long history of collaboration on landmark court cases and breakthrough research. As early as the Nixon administration, he has pushed for equal federal and state education funding. He has also advocated for a more enlightened view in the way standardized tests are used in admissions. At Georgetown's Center on Education and the Workforce, he has continued that work. The center has produced many notable publications, including those investigating the return on higher education tuition or investments, another comparing multiple education pathways to good jobs, and another calling out the fallacies in the arguments against admission policies supporting diversity. In our conversation, Tony, as he prefers to be called, though he has a doctorate, covers megatrends in education. Knowing about these trends is like knowing about the weather before setting sail. Your trajectory can be influenced by the flowing of the wind. I hope you will join us.
I'm Tony Carnavale. I'm the director of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce.
Awesome, thank you. And we had a chance to talk previously, and you talked about how the center was created. Could you just revisit that for me? Just a little bit about how the center came into being?
The reason the center exists is because the world changed and needed us.
Mm-hmm.
And the way the world changed, there are two major sets of facts about the world and the way it works now as opposed to then. Mm-hmm. And when I say then, I mean before the 1980s mm-hmm. in the United States and in all advanced industrial countries. And the two mega trends that occurred was that beginning in the 1980s, it became increasingly important to get at least some, and ideally more, mm-hmm. if you could, mm-hmm. post-secondary education and or training if you wanted to get a good job. You got to remember that in the 70s, the majority of jobs went to people with high school degrees, as did the majority of good jobs, okay. that paid, in our data, a minimum of 45 grand a year before you were age 40. And I emphasize minimum because a lot of them paid more than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when I think about megatrends, there are five that I came up with, and I'm hoping that we could chat through at least a few of them. So the five that came to mind, I'll say them all up front, and then we could see how many of these we could pick off. So one is the increased cost of higher education, in many cases, rising faster than inflation. The second is the increased need for middle skills. So there's been a lot said about a lack of student preparation for middle jobs requiring middle skills. Third is what I'll call a reassessment of the viability of multiple pathways to good jobs. So what does it take? Do you need to go to college? How much college do you need in order to arrive at a good job? A fourth one is colleges moving towards being test optional. And this includes Harvard, even though it's temporary. I think they're going to go until 2026 and revisit whether being test optional is a good route for them. But a lot of D3 schools like Bates and Bowdoin, colleges like that have already done it, and I think permanently. And then the last is a potential, what I'm considering a potential shift in the functional mission of colleges. So, colleges traditionally, especially the highly selective ones, have been thinking about traditional merit, traditional ideas of merit, and this belief that what they're doing with their admissions is rewarding merit. Whereas now, there's more talk about colleges focused on providing opportunity and upward mobility for students. So thinking about the change in the pathway of a student that a college could provide, as opposed to just simply rewarding high test scores and high GPAs. So those are the five that I came up with. So what are your thoughts? Let's maybe with the increased cost of higher education.
Higher education costs more in America because higher education is a very inefficient industry.
Mm,
It is largely a competition among institutions
hmm.
over prestige.
Right.
That is, there's the prestige of going to college and getting a college degree, which is an expectation that most families now have for their children,
Hmm.
which can be tough on their children, but it's essentially a correct instinct.
Hmm.
So the difficulty is that we have no efficiency standards for college,
Hmm.
and there is a fundamental problem for many colleges, and that is they all run like cafeterias. That is, every college, every four-year college, let's
Right.
say, but it's also true to some extent in two-year colleges, but every four-year college has to have the full array of products and services in order to attract students, especially if they want to attract students whose parents have enough money to pay for college.
Right.
So colleges have been for a very long time adding all sorts of, you got to remember that a college is a hotel, it's a restaurant, it's a place where people live.
Right.
They're little communities.
Hmm.
So that's very expensive to build a community. So if you build one where everybody has to have access to anything that they might want,
Hmm.
then like, when you go to the food store,
Right.
there's, 100 kinds of peanut butter.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there has been no discipline about that. Now, what has changed is that the rising cost of college has fallen on families, in part, again, there are lots of culprits in this story, in part because the federal and state governments have essentially stopped funding them. Because in the states where the primary declines have been in college funding, well, the Fed has declined as well, but the states are the major decline.
Hmm.
They have lots of other priorities. If they want to participate in a lot of federal programs, they have to come up with their own share, say in
Right.
healthcare.
Right.
Highway programs, got to
Hmm.
come up with their own share.
Hmm.
And then there's the competition between higher education and K-12 education, grade school and high school. Grade school and high school have unions,
Hmm.
which push for appropriations for those institutions
Hmm.
and are quite successful. And on top of that,
Hmm.
the real power has gone to judges,
Interesting.
in that although we lost, and I was involved in this case, I was one of the authors, we took a case to the Supreme Court in 1973 in which we demanded access to education for all and equity. That is, in those days, equity meant equal funding.
Oh, right.
Doesn't mean that anymore.
Mm.
But nowadays it means adequacy, which means unequal funding. You should fund students according to their needs. But we lost the case. We lost the case because President Nixon got to appoint 4 justices, and in spite of the fact that Brown v. Board of Education had passed, which is why we thought our lawsuit demanding equal funding would pass, we lost.
Mm.
And so ever since then, there's been no real pressure for equity. And then in addition to that, the judges themselves have moved in and said it is not about equal funding. It's about unequal funding. You should fund adequately. If you have a student that needs more than another student, you should make those resources available. So higher education has never had the courts and the unions.
Okay.
K-12 does. So on the last day when you're making your budget as a governor or a president, the last week, you sit down in these awful meetings with people in which you say who's going to lose and who's going to win.
Right.
In the end, higher education always loses because it just
Interesting.
does not have the political leverage that other things do in both federal and state budgets.
Hmm. Hmm. Interesting. One case I recall from, I guess, the 80s are cases where there was a push to move funding for K-12 off of federal property taxes. And because the idea was that when funding is based on property taxes, and inequality is baked into the system.
So this is where the issue began, and it began in a lot of places, but principally the one that we all know well is California, where Proposition 13 defunded the government pretty much. That is, it basically said you could only raise your property taxes by so much.
Right.
And that ended up being the Rodriguez case that I was involved in because we were first in line at the Supreme Court on the same issue. But what happened thereafter is that even in California, which is a very liberal state, spends a lot of money on education, but the way they got some semblance of equal spending was they drove down the spending in the districts at the top instead of raising the spending at the districts at the bottom.
Right.
So this has been and it's still going on. There's a funding issue here. The property tax was the enemy. I worked on that court case, and as a result of that, I was hired by the Nixon administration because the Nixon administration's answer to the property tax rebellion, which had really started in a big way in California, then spread all over the country, was they were going to have a value-added tax, which is a whole different kind of tax, and it's a tax on consumption. It's a tax you pay at the grocery store when you go shopping. They were going to have a value-added tax, and they were going to use all the money from the value-added tax in a program that they called revenue sharing, which did in fact happen. A program they called revenue sharing, and they would share the revenue from the value-added tax with the states so they could replace at least a share of the local property tax. Well, the value-added tax never passed. Revenue sharing did, and it wasn't dedicated to education. It was just general revenue sharing with states. So we never solved that problem, and it's always been about local, state, and federal taxation. What has happened is the state contributes more as a share to education. That's really how that was resolved. The Fed never really contributed a whole lot more. It's always been constrained. And in the old days, it was a fight between education and defense spending. Then it became a fight between things like education and spending for Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid.
Right. That's interesting that you mentioned the value-added tax, because what occurs to me, or especially associated with groceries, because in Virginia right now, the governor who was elected on a platform that included the reduction of tax on groceries makes me wonder whether education funding is tied to that in any way. I don't know.
In the end, it will be. In the end, the way you fix that and maintain the tax is you give a tax credit, and even a refundable tax credit, which means if you owe no taxes, the government gives you some money.
Right.
And you target that on lower income families. Simply dismissing the tax altogether is not sensible. I mean, that means there's going to be cuts in government services somewhere. And again, it will probably end up being, at the end of the day, higher education will suffer.
So one of the themes that I feel has come out of the discussions about cost of education has been something that you've written on, focused on the return on the investment. So I did take a look at the report that you wrote and how you categorized or stratified, ranked institutions based upon the degree to which it provides that return. So I'm curious to hear more about that, and your thoughts about how parents could potentially be looking at institutions a little bit differently. I mean, we tend to focus on, rankings from magazines. I won't mention the name, but in addition to that, what you've done with that report is to give people another way of thinking about how they could be ranking the institutions they're interested in.
In the end, the returns to post-secondary education and training are good. That is,
Mm-hmm.
in the modern economy, with notable exceptions, in the modern economy, you do really need some kind of post-secondary education or training after high school in
Okay.
order to get a good job. About 20% of high school jobs ending up being what we call good jobs. Jobs will pay at least 45K a year before you're age 40.
Mm-hmm.
But that 20% of high school jobs, virtually all of those go to males. So for women,
Mm.
there is no alternative. They have to
Interesting.
go on to post-secondary education and training. So I don't know. I mean, this is the reality of the American economy now, and the returns vary all over the place.
Okay.
About 75% of bachelor's degrees end up being good jobs.
Mm-hmm.
About 40% of middle skill jobs,
Mm-hmm.
less than a bachelor's degree, more than high school, end up being good jobs. And only about 15% or so of high school jobs end up being good jobs. So
Wow.
you can get a good job at any level of education, but it gets harder and harder the further away you get from the BA.
Ah, interesting. I'm glad that you provided that additional framing. Um, I've had multiple conversations with colleagues over the years about their children who may or may not be headed to college, maybe headed to a community college. And I work for an organization that represented community colleges for a decade. And so I do recognize that there's a lot of opportunity associated with community college. But there's always this conundrum about how to provide appropriate encouragement for students who may be struggling, and some people are saying, well, I don't know if you're cut out for college. There's that sort of elephant in the room kind of thing, where if a student is having a hard time in high school, you wonder, well, can they make it in college? Do you have any perspective on how parents could go about that? Because there's two things. One is just the ability of the student. The second is the potential return on an investment. But then also the thing that we're talking about before about middle skills and the need for middle skills. And I find myself not wanting to really conclude for that student what that student should do. But given those three sets of megatrends, what are your thoughts about how parents can be planning better for their children?
Well, in the end, the bottom line, at least for an economist, which is what I am, is the bottom line, which is money.
Yeah.
And the harsh reality is that you're going to need more education than high school. Not certainly. If you're male and you end up as part of the new technology-based economy at a fairly less educated level, or you end up in the old industrial economy, which is still there
Mm-hmm.
and making a little bit of a comeback at the moment, not as much as Joe Biden would like us to think it is,
Right.
but it's making a little bit of a comeback. There's altogether too much focus on this at the moment, because this is how you win the middle Western states in a presidential election. So Donald Trump and Joe Biden are no different from one another in that they're over promoting manufacturing jobs. So there is there are, in the end, the preparation, you can only do what's available to you.
Right.
So in the American system, the way that works, and it didn't always work this way, but prior to 1983, we had a lot of vocational education in high school.
Right.
In 1983, beginning with a report called The Nation at Risk, which is universally agreed to by all American elites, we decided that there's going to be no more voc ed. That what we're going to do is to guarantee every American child, young person, an education through high school that was a general education, 3 years of math, 4 years of English, history, 1 or 2 computer courses nowadays, but it's an academic curriculum. It doesn't prepare you to work. So we've claimed since then, and a lot of people go to court over this with schools. We've claimed that high school will make you college and career ready. Well, it makes a lot of people college ready because of the academic curriculum in grade school and high school, but it doesn't make anybody career ready. So you've got to go on to post-secondary. Now, there are all sorts of programs now in different states where people, since we threw voc ed out of the curriculum, and I should point out, we did it for another reason that was in some ways even as more powerful than the demand that we gave American youth a solid academic education, and that is race, class, and gender tracking. That is the old high school system did that openly, aggressively, and without any apologies. 5% of the kids were supposed to go to college. The rest were not. So they got vocational education. The women got, home economics and typing. And they all got, apart from that 5%, they got a very watered down academic curriculum. That stopped in '83, which is a good thing. But then ever since then, we've been trying to figure out how do we get applied learning and something that will help people move towards post-secondary education and training actually, and move toward a decent job. That's been the struggle, and it's an ongoing struggle ever since.
Well, yeah, it's interesting to point out that 5% because it makes me think about almost being the opposite of Du Bois' talented 10th. So, and there was always that struggle between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington about what kind of education could help elevate African Americans from, previous states of servitude. And so the question was, should it be academic or should it be vocational? And, Washington focused on vocational and Du Bois focused on academic. But for Du Bois, there was this idea of promoting it even more for the quote unquote elite and that talented 10th. But what you're discussing is almost like the opposite, right? It's sort of, the fifth, that 5% that you were saying, that where they were pushed more into vocational education. And I think that's part of the stigma that still lasts when it comes to thinking about how to promote certain levels of education for students. How do you suggest to a student that they shouldn't go to a four-year institution? How do you suggest, or maybe you don't suggest it? But that's the trickiness that I've been wanting to work through.
Well, we could use that debate between Du Bois and Washington. Again, we're actually having it. And I think we're having it if you talk to people in the Black Caucus on the Hill, this is a very live debate. Or the Hispanic Caucus, or the people who support help for people who are in need in any other sort of way. So there is, or who are less advantaged in America. So the debate at the moment is interesting because we started, one way to think about it is in the last in the election, beginning with the Clinton-Trump election, that debate was live. And where the Democratic Party came down was on free college, which really meant for people with incomes below a certain level. For Biden, it was $125K, the guy who eventually won on the Democratic side. But the way the debate ran was that we wanted free college. We weren't going to get that. That is, the votes just weren't there. And a substantial share of Americans don't believe that everybody needs to get a bachelor's degree. But a substantial share of Americans, an almost equal share, agree that you need more than high school nowadays to get a decent job. So we ended up with free community college, and that went away. So I think that was the natural compromise and would have done a lot of good, because while we claim, and American educators claim, that high school is going to make you college and career ready, it doesn't. So, and those are the new lawsuits. And so if we would have expanded the playing field, and the Biden people wanted to expand it in two directions, which I agree with. We wanted preschool at the front end and free community college at the far end.
Right.
That would have given us enough of a playing field to make people actually, or get closer, a lot closer to making people college and career ready. So when we lost on those, we lost a lot. Oh, I think they're both going to come back. So the difficulty here, and there's a further difficulty since, and it was the minority communities in America, especially Latinos and African Americans, indigenous people, and so on. When Biden moved from free college to free community college, which he had to do for political reasons, there was a great hue and cry because emphasizing middle skill jobs, sub-baccalaureate jobs, training jobs, there's going to be a lot more training coming. When you emphasize that, we already have a system that is highly segregated by race, class, and once you get to college, by gender. But you have highly segregated by race and class. And that segregation has shown itself most strongly between the 4-year degree and sub-baccalaureate, 2-year degrees, training certificates, industry-based certifications, and so on. Although the majority of people who get industry-based certifications, like a Microsoft certificate or certification, already have a college degree. But I mean, in the end, in America now, you need education, but oftentimes you also need some training. So there is that divide. If we had free community college, that divide would have become much worse. So there was a strong reaction saying that we don't want two systems that work, because that 4-year system works for advantaged people and white people. When there are two systems that work, if we make free community college, we know who's going to be in the community college system. They're already there. They're minorities, less advantaged kids, immigrants, so on and so forth. So there is this segregation issue between what Booker T. Washington thought of as training and Du Bois thought of as education. And that is a problem. It continues to be a problem going forward in the United States, although we're about to get substantial increases in good jobs for people who only have training. Because of the infrastructure bill, and almost the majority of those jobs will go to males who have high school and then need a little bit of training. So, I mean, we're about to reinforce this. Problem with the whole infrastructure ideal and the movement towards funding training with public money, which we're moving towards aggressively, is that it will end up being a highly segregated system, more segregated than it already is. On the other hand, and the other thing with infrastructure is in about 8 years, 7 or 8 years, those jobs go away because it takes a lot more people to build something than to run it.
Well, I guess there's no easy answer then, really, for parents when it comes to, trying to develop an arc, thinking about, because at least for us, when it came to our children, we were thinking all the way through, what do they need to do in kindergarten? What do they need to do in elementary school? And where will that lead, in terms of high school? So we were trying to think of the whole arc. And when you're trying to do that, all of your decisions can fall into a sequence. And, based upon your ambition and the trajectory that your child helps to demonstrate through their ability, you then start, forming these expectations. And I guess the challenge here is that I think it's very difficult for some parents to really get a hold on that and to really key in on how their expectations should guide what they do in the day-to-day. But at the very least, it does seem that that there's more reason to be hopeful these days for parents who are finding that their children are more likely to, or less likely, let's say, to get a four-year college degree. I think maybe that's at most what we could say about what's happening. Does that ring true for you?
Yeah, over the next several years especially, and
Mhm.
I think in the longer term at a much reduced rate, the access to the four-year degree, while it still will be the closest thing to a sure thing,
Mhm.
in terms of somebody getting a good job someday,
Yeah.
1 out of 4 BA level jobs are not good jobs.
Mhm.
It's not to say they aren't jobs you should throw away.
Right.
They're jobs that just don't pay well.
Right.
And that includes a lot of jobs in education, counseling, childcare. There are a lot of people in America who need high levels of education to do a job, but they don't get paid.
Right. Right.
That's a whole other issue. But
Mhm.
so in the end, yes, the economy is opening up.
Mhm.
We're starting to, and infrastructure will make this feel very strong over the
Mhm.
next 7 years. You're going to hear a lot about apprenticeships and a
Mhm.
whole series of things that will in fact grow a lot.
Mhm.
And the only thing about that is that in the long term, a lot of those jobs, the infrastructure jobs in particular, will disappear. But we also know that the share of Americans who only have high school degrees
Mhm.
is getting smaller and smaller and smaller.
Mhm.
So when there are, the one law that continues to operate always in economics is supply and demand.
Right.
So that if you have a low supply of high school educated workers, their wages are going to rise because
Okay.
people will be chasing them. So we are getting rising wages for high school graduates in America
Okay.
now. And there's reason to believe
Mhm.
that will continue because of the declining size of the American workforce.
Mhm.
So that more and more, notwithstanding huge increases in immigration,
Right.
more and more, those high school graduates are more and more valuable
Okay.
and will
Interesting.
have more and more opportunities and more training opportunities as well, because we're finally going to invest more in training.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. All right. So can we just pivot for a minute onto another topic, and then that would be great. We can conclude. But I wanted to pivot into the testing part, because that leans into something where you have great expertise. So there's the two issues. One is the movement of colleges into test optional status. And then this idea of the functional mission of colleges, they're actually tied together to me in a way, because by removing testing from the calculus, in some ways, I see it also as a college of pivoting into looking more broadly at how they're going to accept students, and thinking more broadly about their mission. But what are your thoughts on what's happening within the testing world?
I think, and I used to be vice president of the Education Testing Service, which makes the SAT.
Mhm.
So I know it well. The removal of testing, or its diminution, it's the de-emphasis
Mhm.
on testing, because it's not gone away.
Mhm.
It's sort of gone away here and there and matters less here and there. But in the end, that will allow, what that allows colleges to do is to decide who they're going to admit.
Mhm.
Uh, so, but the truth is, apart from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, places where they have so much money they don't know what to do with it, the bottom line in the vast majority of American colleges is their business model.
Mm.
That is, every year, if you're a college president and you show up 4 years in a row at the board meeting with a deficit budget, you're going to get fired.
Mhm. Mhm.
So the bottom line, especially given the constraint on money in America, is that you've got to make your business model work. And
Okay.
it's the business model, a lot more than testing, that keeps people out.
Mm.
So you take away testing, and even in the cases where they've done that, the research literature says it doesn't change anything.
Interesting.
It basically allows the college to let in more affluent students, allows the colleges to let in more legacies, the kids of people who went there or worked there, and allows the college to, it gives the colleges more power to choose their classes. But the way they choose their classes is they're looking at their budget. So, you have a certain number of students that you admit very quickly,
right,
who pay full price. I mean, foreign students, out-of-state students, and you are just affluent, kids from affluent families. You let them in, ideally on early admission, so you begin the year already knowing what most of next year's budget looks like. And then after that, the ideal balance there is you want 50%, and most colleges don't make this, but you want 50% of the kids to pay full boat. And then what you do is you bargain with middle class and upper middle class families, because they can pay most of the cost. But they come to the campus, they meet with the admissions director, there are these conversations about, it's a bargaining, it's like buying a car. So, you get a discount, or what most colleges call merit aid. It's not really merit aid, it's a discount. So you get a discount, you try to fill most of the rest of your seats that way, so that the full payers and the people who pay most of it, or take out loans to pay out most of it. And then you've got, generally, in say an elite college, you've got 5 to 10% of your seats left that you can give to people who have financial need.
Wow.
And more often than not, it's 5 if you're a very elite college. So even a lot of colleges that have billions of dollars in the bank, they're not going to spend that billions of dollars on students. They're going to spend it on buildings. So, in the end, or on nothing. Because what part of the competition for prestige is to have the biggest endowment. So there is I don't think, testing is reducing the emphasis of testing, because it wasn't so much that testing was useless, it was just used too much and overused. The difference between a kid who gets an average score on the SAT or the ACT has about an 80% chance of graduating from the top 100 colleges if they went, but of course they don't go, they don't get let in. So the test was just grossly overused as a component of your prestige profile. That people have a tendency so they can brag at the barbecue or the cocktail hour, brag about where their kids are going to college, and they'll pay anything they have to. To make sure they got the right T-shirt and the right bumper sticker. So there is that market is going to grow in America, because we're getting more and more families with 2 bachelor's degrees at the head of the household, and families with 2 bachelor's degrees at the head of a household generally make enough money so they can afford a selective college with some discount oftentimes. So that part of the market is growing. The part of the market, the rest of the market, the total market, is declining. The number of kids who are college age, and most of them, where there is any growth, it's less advantaged kids who require more money, not less money, in order to make it through college.
Wow, that's such an interesting way of looking at it. I guess you described yourself as an economist, so I guess that's the way to look at it. If you're looking at it from an economic perspective, it's that. Some of us on the other side who have been focused more on policy, diversity and equity, we're thinking more about qualitative decisions that schools might be making, or sort of values-driven decisions that they could be making. But when you break it down and think about budgets, it's a different calculus. So it would seem, though, that for the parents who are thinking about how much more money to spend on test preparation, it seems like there are more colleges where, that cost might be less justified. But you're
Well,
saying,
except that to the extent that you can do test prep or pay for test prep and get a higher test score, you always want to submit that even to a college who doesn't ask for the test score.
okay,
And that is the way I know in a number of colleges, there's a standard conversation that goes on.
right.
Is if you're a kid they want to admit
Mm-hmm.
and you've got low test scores, they tell you not to submit your test scores
Right.
because you will reduce, if they get all the kids with test scores below the test score they want
Mm-hmm.
for their average test score, they get the kids below that not to submit their test scores.
Right.
So they end up with a higher test score
Right.
in the
Right.
college rankings. And then, so it is a game. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what parents have to recognize.
Yeah.
They're in a game.
Mm-hmm.
And the odds in the game, as in most games that have any economic basis, the odds are much better for people with money than people without.
Right. Right. Wow. Thank you so much. This has been great. We really touched on all of the mega trends. We didn't necessarily follow each bullet point all the way through, but in the course of the conversation, we've covered all of that. So I think I neglected to ask you this when we attempted this interview before, and but if you could go back, so given everything that you know about how education works, the different components that we discussed, the different trends and such, if you could anonymously go back in time and counsel your parents and encourage them to do something, either to continue to do something that they were already doing, or perhaps to do something different, what would you do? At what point in time would you go back into your past, and what would you have them to do?
I think I was very fortunate
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that I came from a household where there was no job. My father was a disabled World War II veteran, so there was no job. We lived on VA money, Veterans Administration money. So, but the one thing he did do is he went to college on the GI Bill. He was shortly thereafter bedridden and couldn't really work. But so I got that message, I think. And I also remember my mother used to say to me and my brothers, I have a bunch of brothers. She used to say to us, you can't sing, you can't dance, you damn well better stay in school. You're not going anywhere.
Right.
So, I am grateful for that. For some reason, even though I think we were, if you looked at us statistically, we weren't supposed to go to college. All three of us got a PhD. And the reason that happened was because there was no other roadway for us that even indirectly, I never could conceive of becoming a business person. That was just something that was beyond me. So what I did is I just stayed in school. We all did that. We just stayed in until they kicked us out.
Right.
And it worked out. I mean, it did work out. I mean, it was not a very fancy strategy.
Sure.
None of us majored in anything in undergraduate school that you could sell. So, but we all went to graduate school, and that was the point. We went to graduate school because we knew it would get us a job.
Awesome. Dr. Carnevale, thank you so much again for taking the time out, and I'll tell the audience, I messed it up the first time, but you were so gracious to join.
Listen, that happens all the time, and more, oftentimes it happens at my end.
I'm so grateful to Tony for taking our time to share his perspectives, not only because his experience is so comprehensive, but because this is our second take. I didn't hit the record button the first time. But to recap, Tony said that a 4-year degree still gives students the best chance at a good job, but there are still reasons to be optimistic if a bachelor's degree doesn't seem likely. Also, thinking about the likely increase in manufacturing jobs, though mild, and the recently passed infrastructure bill, he believes that jobs requiring middle skills or trades will increase. On colleges going test optional, He said that families should still consider taking one of the standardized tests, especially if their students do well on them. Lastly, he reinforced the power of example by seeing his father seek education despite physical disability, along with his mother offering realism about Tony's other options. His parents shaped his outcomes. I greatly admire the impact that Tony has had on the education policy community and by extension on families seeking better opportunities. I hope you enjoyed the conversation and will consider subscribing, or at the very least, will join us again. Thank you and take care.